I am so distressed in all that's happening. Throughout this week, you would think after George Floyd, with law enforcement across the world, that that'll be it. And yet there is so much resurfacing of the murders and abuse that has taken place upon the lives of our black brothers and sisters. Yes, others are also being abused in other communities, but there is a obvious prevalence within the black community, and that's why there's an uprise in this anti-racial world today. And I wanted to just give you a little perspective, more of my testimonial as a black man, but also some reviews here, if I can, about this whole idea of slavery. Because slavery is not new, folks. Slavery is in the Old Testament, and it's also in the New Testament. And in fact, if you read it wrongfully, you might think that slavery was actually encouraged by God. Not so at all. Because the word slavery actually means something different than what we have coined it to be over the last 400 years. When you think of slavery, you always think of the beginning of black people. How sad is that when the world is at least 6,000 to 7,000 years old from the Garden of Eden? That God created human beings, one human race, through Adam and Eve. And as we split off into various regions from chapters 11 of Genesis, where he confounded the languages because man and woman wanted to make a name for themselves, the word tells me in chapter 11. And God split us off into various regions, and I want to suggest perhaps the equator versus the north and the east pole, where there is cold versus warmth. Over centuries and centuries and centuries, I want to suggest that the colors may have faded slightly and affected us in the way we look over centuries and centuries, but we are really one race, one human race. And if you want proof of that, then just cut every person open and you will see our material inside is exactly the same. I would suggest then what may have happened is the environment may have been a contributing factor to why we may look different on the outside. But on the inside, we are really one race for God's kingdom. And I, in particular, I can give you my testimony if you wouldn't mind. But before I do, we want to talk about slaves of righteousness today, much more because we're talking about an epidemic or pandemic that we've learned is not just a pandemic of virus, but it's a pandemic of racism. And that really is the bigger topic today, because I would tell you, if you observe for the last few weeks, and if you observe even to this very day, the protest that is happening, there seems to be an ignorance of the pandemic of the virus, because what became much more important was the pandemic of anti-racial inequality. And all of a sudden, this virus that everyone may have been afraid of became secondary. Why? Because what's most important is people's life. Life for you and I, that we must live in harmony as God's children, one with the other. It doesn't matter where we are in this world. And I want to report to you that when I started off a few weeks back with this virus, I have a little note here with some facts that will show you that when we started off, we were only starting off with a few people. We had 159 back in March the 15th. When I was there in Guyana, starting off with this concept. There was only 159,000 cases of the virus and only 6,000 deaths. And I'm going to show you a slide now, if I can, just to show you where we are today. And our wonderful country of Brazil is now rising up into a new second place behind the USA. And now we're talking of a global of 7.9, let's say 8 million cases and 51,000 new cases as of yesterday, and total deaths is approaching 500,000, which is 433,000 across the world. And then you will see on the chart there, USA still leads the way, I would say, by bad leadership and bad choices. And Brazil is now in second place next to Russia, India, UK, and Canada. We should be proud, in spite of all, a multicultural society like Canada, of our leaders and our medical field that I would suggest is making the right decisions for us, that has safeguarded us this last little while. So we only 100,000. In fact, we have less cases than America has deaths. Now, mind you, they're 10% the size of our population, but it still means a lot to us when you think about here north of the border, how we have done well, and we only have 8,000 deaths. That is just very, very blessed to us. But meanwhile, as we reopen, do safeguard yourself, as I mentioned to you before, and make sure we understand what's happening. Let me show you another stats if I can. The next slide will tell you our population factor. And I thought it was important for us to just look at this because we are now, that little yellow circle you see there is telling us currently right now in 2020, we are 7.8 billion people of a population. 7.8 billion. But if you go back just to the 1800s, and there wasn't much more data prior to that for obvious reasons. There was not much information to share about the population of the world, starting from the Garden of Eden up until the first century when Christ was there. But until the 1800s, we were looking at 1 million people. 1 million people just over 200 years ago, we had 1 million people. 200 years later, we have escalated to 7.8 billion. And if you go to the 1900s, where you will see the Spanish flu hit us in the early 1900s, you would see there we were just rising at 2 million people. And yet over 25 million died of the Spanish flu. And yet when we escalate now to the year 2100, which is another 80 years from now, it's anticipating there's going to be 15.6 billion people in the world. Wow. If God tarries, that's a lot of people to contend with. But yet, of all those people, whether it's brown, yellow, black, or blue, or white, think about this. It's one race. Doesn't matter what the numbers are. Doesn't matter how long God prolongs this earth for us. It's only one human race. And what has happened is we've caused a divide, and that divide has happened through economic underprivileged humans, where the weak gets weaker and the strong gets stronger, where the haves and the have-nots, there's a big divide. And that was taking place in Israel in the Old Testament. And all I want to share with you is my personal testimony very shortly. But if you look at the Old Testament, you will see many, many references there about slavery that was taking place. But slavery really is a term that was just only incorporated in the last 100 years or so, when blacks became much more enslaved through the African passage. And I'll go there in a moment if I can with you. But prior to that, in the Old Testament, the Hebrew word is ebed. And the Hebrew word ebed, you'll see in Exodus, in Leviticus, in Deuteronomy, references there where God was giving Israelites instructions of people who would be enslaved by families. But that enslavement was not the word slave, even though the King James interprets it now as S-L-A-V-E. The NIV may do the same thing as well. But the actual word for that is bond servant. Means you are bonded in a family as a servant to do what? To do domestic work or to hire yourself so you can have the economic power to have employment, if so be. And that was the purpose behind the whole idea of slavery in the Old Testament. Now, there are a couple of references, perhaps, that you may question. If you want to do so, you can Facebook me or ask me a question about that for some more further research. But basically, Leviticus 25, verse 39, I want to give you this passage here. If thy brother that dwelleth by thee be waxen poor, and be sold unto thee, thou shalt not compel him to serve as a bond servant. So the most common and general word always indicates subjection without the idea of bondage. Keep that in mind. Even in the Old Testament, where there are laws to guide how people were to be servants in a home, it was based on their economic deprivation, or the sense of subjection to wanting to earn finances by selling themselves into a family, if that's the case, all right? And they were given the privilege as an equal in that family, not under bondage, but just being a servant. In fact, if you read further on Leviticus, you will see that even on the Sabbath day, bond servants, quote, slaves, were to also honor the Sabbath day. So how did we get to where we are today? In the New Testament, we're going to get there very shortly as well. But the treatment of people through the story of Egypt, with the Israelites being enslaved to work, and the way they were beaten, and the way they were constrained to being subjected to being less of a human. Moses came and set them free. They themselves did what? When they went through the Exodus and even established themselves, they recognized the importance of aligning themselves on the families so that they too can have employment and have earnings if they were too poor, that others can see the same as well. Well, let me just jump, if I can, and talk about myself for the most part, okay? I have been, because all through these centuries, in the 1600s, is when you will really see, through the Dutch and the Portuguese and the French and of course the Spanish, you will see the Inquisitions there when they went to the Africas, in most cases in West Coast Africa. In Ghana, I was there myself a few years ago, and I experienced Elmina Castle, the slave castle that was established by the Dutch and the Spanish initially, and then taken over by the Portuguese as well as the British. You will see in that experience I went through myself. Let me give you my testimony, because up until the 1600s, the 1500s, I would say, all right, even though there was slavery happening all around the world, okay, there was never been a people like us, like the black community, that has been considered animals. We weren't considered humans when they went to Africa. In Africa, when they went and found there were black-skinned people, they branded us as less than human, less than Caucasian. In fact, the Constitution that was written back then, and even up until this 19th century, will tell you that blacks were considered 2/3 of a human. 2/3 of a human. You can do some research on that as well. So we struggle for that opportunity to be equal, because in that castle I experienced, I learned that slaves were brought from the tribes into the castle, and they were chained, and I can give you the gory stories about how they were treated and so on, but they were chained. And the way the castle was set up at the ocean's front, in the front they had a gauge where you could not enter the slave castle unless a bridge was put down, and then they would bring you into the castle. They'd bring you in chains, and they would put you and they would wait for the ships to come back, and the ships would be behind the castle with an escape from the dungeon right into the slave ship. And they would put you on there and bring you into the Americas. Now, I'm not going to talk about the gory stories, but the point of the matter is this. What is my heritage? And what is your heritage if you're a black person? Because I'm sharing today that we're all one human race. But how did God have us divided where we are now, recognizing the inequality of our cultures? And people were sent from the Americas, it's called the Passageway, and the Caribbean, which I am now a product of. And I went to Africa when I was in my 40s. It took me 40 years of not knowing my story and my history, of my heritage, which most of us will deny today. And I had to go to Africa to find my heritage. And when I went to Africa, it took a very painful experience first to be called a white man. And that's why I want to talk about my story. Because you've heard this before. My grandfather is an English plumber. His name is Plumber, from England, and he was a plantation owner in Trinidad. And he was married to his own Caucasian wife. What happened was he got his seamstress pregnant. And his seamstress was Indian. And when she got pregnant, he boot her off the plantation. As a result, my grandmother grew up more or less on the streets with her mother, who died shortly after. And my dad, who is now, remember, my dad is now half white and half Indian. And he grew up with his mom and grandmother. His mom died when he was about 6 years of age. So he was with his grandmother until 14 when she passed away. And up until 14 years of age, after that, he was on his own. My dad lived on his own from 14, more or less, with no family structure, because his father abandoned him. That's my story. I had to live with that when my mother encountered my dad then, who was a black woman. When I was birthed with my twin sister, we are now 50% black, 25% white, and 25% Indian. And yet, all of my life, in my 40s, up until my 40s, I was branded as a black person. And I had to go to Africa to get a hold of myself, realizing when I went there, in Ghana, they call me Abrini. And Abrini means white man. Am I confused? Am I hurting today to see what's happening? Because I am on both extremes now. I'm a black man, also 25% white and 25% Indian, and I'm seeing this human race of dividedness and inequality, hurting and fighting against each other. And I've had to live through this all of my life. Now let's fast forward to the New Testament. Let's fast forward to Jesus showing up on the scene, because Jesus was born an Israelite. He was born a Jew just the same way. He was birthed through the Virgin Mary, all right, and the Holy Spirit implanted himself into Mary, of course, Joseph being his earthly father, but Mary really was a Jew who Christ was born from. And you can imagine the racial tension even then, because Jews consistently also had to fight for cultural equivalence. From the slavery in Egypt up until the promised land in Canaan, and even all the way through the journey of judgments and all the issues of them trusting God, not trusting God, disobeying God, and having idolatry, and God releasing and saving them, all through that journey right to the New Testament, they were always looking for a savior to make them a great nation. It's interesting. Is it a great race or a great nation? Because we're talking about a race for the most part, and this race has caused such cultural divide. And Jesus demonstrates equality to every human being he encountered. Everyone who was a non-Jew who encountered Jesus were not judged because of their race. They were judged based on their sinfulness. Now think about that for a moment. God is going to judge us not based on our race and our culture, because when God looks down on his creation, he does not see race. He sees humanity. He sees people that he created in his image, irregardless of what they look on the outside, because on the outside, whether you're black, white, brown, or yellow, you are made in the beautiful expression of God himself, in his image. That means that your color, in fact, the color of black is called the perfect color. And I mentioned earlier on, if you're born on the equator, you have a much more hue to the sun that causes you to be pigmented with dark color. But having said that, every color there is, red, yellow, white, pink, blue, green, you name it, they all come out of the perfect color of black. Check it out yourself and you'll see. And yet there seems to have occurred over the centuries, even from the New Testament, this misnomer that something is wrong with the color black. And that's why it may be called the White House. That's why we have this notion that white is pure and black is not. And yet it's in the creative story of God that I believe blackness is beauty in the eyes of God as well. And we seem to associate that color, and has caused the people who are hewn that way to have judgment placed upon them. So if I can jump, if I can, to Romans chapter 6, verse 18, and then I want to just give reference. Actually, before I do, let me get to my notes for a second here, because I just showed you the slide in Leviticus 25, verse 39, and I want to read this for you if I can. There were some ways of becoming slaves that the Bible forbids. And I want to read this one for you. Exodus 21, verse 16. This is very important for us. This is the Old Testament reading there. Exodus 21, verse 16 says this. It's against kidnapping people into slavery. You're kidding. This is what it says. Anyone who kidnaps another and either sells him or her, or still has him or her when he is caught, must be put to death. You've got to be kidding me. That's actually in the Bible. Yes, you can question all the other factors of slaves must obey their masters. But look at this verse, what it says. It says that anyone who kidnaps another person out of their own will must be put to death. I just said to you that Kimberly Jones said she doesn't want revenge, and we agree with her. We don't want revenge, we want equality. But this verse almost suggests that revenge is possible for kidnapping and enslaving those of God's people. Whatever you think of the death penalty, the Old Testament is very much against kidnapping slaves. Very much against what? The example of African slave, the trade of 3 centuries ago. In fact, 4 centuries ago, over 400 years. Black slavery is a reality. It says here in Deuteronomy as well, in Deuteronomy chapter 15, verse 12, and when you release him or her, do not send him away empty-handed. Supply to them liberally. It says right there in Deuteronomy chapters 15, verses 12 to 14. This is the Old Testament giving credence to bond servants, not slaves, even though in our modern context we use the word slave, which undermines, because even the Holocaust with the Jews, you never hear it used as the word slave, do you? You always find the word slave attached to only one particular group of people. And that atrocity and establishment of kidnapping and undermining a particular group and making them become less than human, that has lived out for centuries, that many of us don't even have the full story behind it, is what this word is telling us. And this is Leviticus 25, verse 40 later on says this: he is to work for you until the year of Jubilee. Then he and his children are to be released, and he will go back to his own clan and to the property of his forefathers. I take his wife, leaves, and family at this point, and they're released. The year of Jubilee was every 50 years. If you read on in the passages through Exodus and Deuteronomy and Leviticus, you will see God gave specific laws that 7 times 7 weeks of 7 days, 49 years, was fine for enslaving for bond servants in your home. But on the 50th year, the year of Jubilee, like Pentecost, like the anointing and the release, right? Like the 50 days when Christ was crucified to when he was resurrected and when he was taken into heaven, all of the above. The year of Jubilee 50 was to release all those you may have as your bond servants, specific to the people of Israel, but I would say to all those who would pay attention to what God was saying. Let me jump forward if I can, because one last question you want to ask is then, why then are we talking about slavery, and who caused it, and what forced it?